Vinta La Union is a magenta ink, and the swatch shows a bit of a gold sheen that is rarely seen in the writing samples. As a magenta, there is a definite red lean with some undertones of pink, which are most obvious in the chromatography. Also in some of the shading. There's a slight bit of tone variation as the papers change, and this is a fairly consistent shading ink, which is very nice. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it seems to be a bit more aggressive and gets deep into the paper. This aggressiveness does lend itself to some minor feathering. Now, sheen is not my thing, but the tone of this ink is very nice and can stand strong on its own on the page. While I like the color, I don't see a need to buy a bottle for myself, but it is very nice and I can completely see why someone would love this.
The pen for today is an Aurora Optima. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the Clairfontaine, we're setting the basis of tone that we're really going to be comparing to all of the other papers. We get a very nice magenta that does not feather and does not spread. It certainly does show a bit of shading through quite a bit of it. There's whole different realms of shading that you can see. If you take a look at realms on the second line, you see that the R is a little bit lighter than the E that darkens quite a bit. Much lighter into the A. The ALMS at the end works its way from lighter to darker, where the to the right of that is a much darker word in its entirety. In shorter words like and on the third line, you can see that it gives us some tone variation where the A and D are lighter than the N in the middle. Looking at the back of the page between the wiggling fingers, I, missed this in the first thoughts part, but you can see that this is a fairly aggressive ink, but it's also a very wet pen that I'm using. So it gets very deep into the paper, does not bleed through touching the page underneath, but there's a significant amount of ghosting as a result of it, meaning you probably could not write on the back of the page.
Vinta makes more than just one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Vinta.
Here is Vinta Pink Sands Shimmering Santa Cruz. Here is Vinta St. John's Laguna. Here is Vinta Ochre. This is all a waste. It was not what was meant to happen here.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here, the tone is slightly darker than it was with the Clairfontaine, only slightly. I'm only really noticing it because I'm looking at it side by side. If it's not side by side, you're not going to notice it. In fact, before I did that, I thought it was the same. There is some minor feathering that does go on. You can see it in the word wristwatches on the first line, where the R and the W, the second W, show a tiny bit of feather that goes on. Just tiny, really being nitpicky to point it out. Now, the shading that goes on is fairly continuous, like you see on continuous on the second line, where the con is a nice mid-tone. The TINU get quite a bit darker, but the OUS at the end start lighter and then work their way darker. Corresponds underneath that shows a nice bit of shading that's going back and forth, not dramatic, but definitely present. Looking at the back of the page between the wiggling fingers, we see that it does get quite deep into the paper quite a few times, not as bad as it did on the Clairfontaine, really speaking very highly of this paper. Now, there's some ghosting that's happening, but I wouldn't count it as the end of the world. It's the deep spots that would concern me more. Would I write on the back of this page? Probably, just because of only a couple spots, but not with this ink because I'd worry about how it might affect both sets of notes.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
I really expected some tone shift to occur on this paper, though it did not. What did happen is the same tone as the Clairfontaine, A light bit of feathering that does occur with on the first line, first word. At the end of the first line in the E of minute. So there's some light feathering that goes on. I don't see it as the end of the world, but it is definitely present. There's a slight bit of spread that is also occurring, I think a little bit because of the more aggressive nature of this particular ink. The shading is kind of present. It's there. You have to take a minute and look for it. If you look at minute on the first line, the M is slightly darker than the IN, and the UTE are slightly darker, working from lighter to darker in there than the min at the beginning. It generally works pretty smoothly when you look at smoothly on the third line, where the SM are a little bit darker, the O's both lighten just a hair, but the TH get quite a bit darker, the L lightens up a little bit, and the Y dark again, though the dark again comes with a little bit of feathering. Looking at the back of the page between the wiggling fingers, we see this is an aggressive ink, getting fairly deep into the page quite a bit. The ghosting that's occurring is really minimal. It's the spotting that occurs that is more of a concern to me. It does not touch the page underneath, but it does stop me from writing back here.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, this smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it doesn't shade any different that we're going to see than on the Clairfontaine. It does a very good job. There's many possible places that you can spot some very nice shading. Taking a look at many possible on the second line, where the M and beginning of the A are darker than the end of the A into the N. The beginning of the Y is lighter than the down loop of the Y. Now, possible right next to that has a lighter beginning of the P. It gets darker into the end of the P, the O, the S's are lighter at the top, darker at the bottom, and the ibble at the end is quite a bit darker. Now, I'm not seeing any kind of spread that's going on. Same line thickness that we had on the Clairfontaine. Certainly doing a very nice job. Looking at the back of the page, we see that this did much better than on the Clairfontaine. Still a few darker spots where it got deep into the paper. No real bleeding, as in it doesn't touch the page underneath. Tiny spots where it's very deep. No ghosting. I think you could easily continue writing back here without any kind of real concern.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more magenta inks.
Here is Vinta Macopa. Here is Sailor Studio 437. Here is Private Reserve Black Cherry. Here is Noodler's Black Swan Australian Rose.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
The tone that we're getting here is a little bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. Not unexpected with this paper. We have no feather and we have no spread. We do still get continuous amounts of shading when you look at continuous on the first line. The C is darker than the on, but the tin darkens up a little bit, except for that cross in the T, where the U lightens up a little bit, darker into the O, lighter into the U, darker into the S. That back and forth quite frequently, I really am enjoying that. This is a great tone of ink on the paper. I just wish it wasn't so aggressive. Looking at the back of the page, we see great performance. No bleeding, no ghosting. Easily writing back here, probably one of the best papers handling this ink, which is, I want to say, a surprise, but not just because of the durability of this paper.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Kaweco Midnight Blue. Here is Vinta Mother of Pearl Nacre. Here is Vinta La Paz. Here is Vinta Romblon.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
As a tone, this is generally much lighter than we had on the Clairefontaine, really showing off that pink undertone, looking more like a pink ink that darkens up towards a magenta in some areas. There is some feathering, nowhere near as much as I would have expected having looked at some of the other papers. There is some general spread that's going on, but the spread is not the end of the world. The biggest difference to me is that the feathering at times can get a little bit distracting. Even though I said it's pretty good in what's going on, the feathering's rather continuous, like when you look at continuous on the second line. From the T on, there's generally a little bit of feathers in all directions. Not the end of the world for this paper, though. This is not really made for fountain pens. Really, it's some of the lower quality paper we can be writing on, so I'm going to fairly consider this a win. Now, as far as some shading, there are a few moments that happen. Again, we're going to look at continuous. The T is only slightly darker than all the letters around it. The U at the end, slightly darker. But mostly what we're getting on this paper is a continuous tone of pink with only little highlights of some darker tones. Looking at the back of the page, we have no surprises as we see this ink is very deep into the paper all the way through. There's no writing back here because of the amount of getting through the paper, but none of it touched the page underneath, so it did a great job in that, which means it could be usable with this paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Aurora Optima has a wet broad nib and puts down an interesting magenta that shows off the red and pink tones it contains. Off camera, I tried this in a dry medium nib and the tone lightened a little bit and kept the fun shading. Still very pleasant on the page. As an aside on that, some of the aggressiveness was tamed a little bit, which was an added bonus. But it's the color that I really enjoyed the most. So while I think every pen will give a very nice tone and shading, I prefer this from a wetter pen. And for me, that would be a wet broad or medium to get the most of the great darker tones. With that, I know I'm going to accept some of the more aggressive nature and maybe not be able to write on the back of some of those pages. If that becomes the major concern for you, then what I would suggest is going with a drier pen.